My laptop displayed the quarterly revenue charts. As I prepared to address our board of directors, the same numbers I'd been analyzing since 3 that morning. Innovate Tech Solutions had grown from a startup in my garage to a $50 million company, but according to my business partner Marcus Chen, I was just along for the ride. Quarterly revenue is up 37%. I began, clicking to the next slide. The boardroom was packed with investors, advisors, and department heads, all watching the presentation I'd spent weeks preparing. Our AI-driven predictive analytics platform has secured contracts with 12 Fortune 500 companies this quarter alone. Marcus shifted in his seat at the far end of the mahogany table, his expensive suit perfectly pressed, his MBA from Stanford prominently displayed behind him in a gold frame. He positioned himself as the face of our company from day one, handling client meetings and investor presentations while relegating me to what he called back-end support. The irony wasn't lost on me. Back-end support. As if developing the revolutionary algorithms that powered our entire platform was some kind of clerical work. The predictive accuracy has improved to 96.4%. I continued, which represents a significant advancement in the field of machine learning applications for business intelligence. Board member Patricia Williams leaned forward. Julia, these numbers are impressive. Can you walk us through the technical improvements you've implemented? Before I could respond, Marcus cleared his throat loudly. Actually, Patricia, I think we should focus on the business metrics rather than getting bogged down in technical details. Not everyone here has a computer science background. I paused mid-click, my finger hovering over the laptop trackpad. This was typical Marcus. Any time the conversation turned to the actual technology that made our company valuable, he redirected to sales figures and market positioning, areas where he could shine while keeping me firmly in shadows. I think the board would benefit from understanding the technical foundation, I said calmly, especially since our upcoming product launch relies heavily on the new algorithms I've developed. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished hardwood floor. The sound cut through the room like a warning shot. Let's be honest here, Julia. You're just the silent money in this partnership. Leave the real decisions to people who understand technology and business strategy. The room fell silent. I could hear the air conditioning humming, could see the uncomfortable glances exchanged between board members. Investment advisor Robert Chen shifted his papers nervously. CFO Patricia Williams stared at her hands. Marcus continued, his voice gaining confidence as he warmed to his theme. Julia's a wonderful person, don't get me wrong. Her initial investment got us started, and we're grateful for that. But running a technology company requires experience, leadership, market understanding. Things that can't be learned from textbooks. My initial investment. As if the $200,000 I'd put in from my previous startup sale was all I'd contributed. As if the countless 18-hour days I'd spent coding, debugging, and perfecting our algorithms were somehow irrelevant. Marcus, I said quietly, perhaps you'd like to explain to the board how our predictive analytics actually work, since you understand technology so well. His face flushed slightly. That's not necessary. What matters is results, not technical minutiae. I nodded slowly, reaching for my briefcase. The leather was worn from years of carrying it to client meetings, investor presentations, and late-night coding sessions. Marcus had always dismissed it as outdated, preferring his sleek aluminum attaché case that matched his MacBook Pro. You're absolutely right, I said, clicking the briefcase latches open. Results are what matter. I pulled out a thick manila folder, the kind that lawyers use for important documents. The papers inside were yellowed with age, some of them dating back 6 years to when I first started developing the core algorithms that would eventually become InnovateTech Solutions. Before we discussed results, I said, placing the folder on the conference table, I think the board should understand who actually owns the intellectual property that generates those impressive revenue numbers Marcus mentioned. Marcus's confident expression flickered. Julia, what are you doing? I opened the folder carefully, revealing the top document. United States Patent and Trademark Office. It read in official government typography. Patent number 10,847,392. Inventor, Julia Martinez. Filed, March 15, 2018. This is the original patent for our predictive analytics engine, I explained to the suddenly attentive board. Filed 18 months before Marcus and I officially became business partners. Patricia Williams reached for the document, her eyes scanning the technical specifications and legal language. Julia, this is the core technology that powers your entire platform. That's correct. I pulled out the next document. Patent 10,923,847. The machine learning optimization algorithms, also filed solely under my name. Marcus had gone very still. The color was draining from his face as board members passed the patents around the table, reading my name as the sole inventor on every single document. And here, I continued, producing a third patent is the natural language processing component that allows our system to analyze unstructured data. Filed 14 months before Marcus joined the company. The boardroom was silent except for the rustling of papers as investors and advisors examined the patents. Robert Chen looked up from his copy, his expression grave. Marcus, were you aware that Julia holds sole ownership of these patents? Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it. His usual smooth confidence had evaporated. We're partners. I assumed. You assumed what? I asked quietly. That because I let you handle sales presentations and investor meetings, you somehow own the technology that makes those meetings possible? I pulled out a laptop from my briefcase. Not the sleek MacBook everyone expected, but a battered ThinkPad covered in coding stickers. The same machine I'd used to write the first lines of code that would eventually become our AI platform. Would you like me to show the board the original source code? I asked, opening the laptop. It's all time-stamped. Every algorithm, every optimization, every breakthrough that Marcus claims to understand so well. The screen displayed a directory full of files, each one dated and documented. Years of work, thousands of hours of development, all bearing my digital signature. Board member David Kim leaned forward. Julia, if you own all the core patents, what exactly is Marcus's role in the company? I looked at Marcus, who was staring at the table like it might offer him escape. That's an excellent question, David. Marcus, would you like to explain to the board what you've contributed beyond sales presentations and taking credit for my work? This is ridiculous, Marcus said, his voice shaking slightly. I've built relationships with clients. I've secured funding. I've managed the business side while Julia focused on coding. Interesting, I said, pulling out another document. Because according to our client contracts, they're specifically licensing my patented technology. The relationships you've built are entirely dependent on intellectual property that belongs to me. Patricia Williams was studying the patents intently. Julia, these are remarkably sophisticated. The technical depth here suggests years of specialized development. 12 years, actually, I replied. I started working on predictive analytics during my PhD program at MIT. The core algorithms in these patents represent the culmination of over a decade of research and development. Marcus suddenly stood up. This is clearly some kind of setup. Julia's trying to undermine our partnership because what? I interrupted. Because I'm tired of being called just the silent money at board meetings. Because I'm sick of watching you take credit for work you couldn't begin to understand. I clicked to a new screen on my laptop, displaying lines of complex code. Marcus, since you understand technology so well, perhaps you could explain to the board what this function does. Marcus stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The code was dense, mathematical, the kind of algorithmic thinking that required years of training to comprehend. That's not. It's the core prediction engine, I said calmly. The algorithm that processes millions of data points and generates the insights our clients pay $50,000 per month to access. I wrote every line of this code. I optimized every function. I debugged every error. David Kim was taking notes now. Julia, what percentage of the company's core technology did you develop personally? I pulled up a technical documentation file. 97%. Marcus's contributions are limited to user interface suggestions and marketing copy. The silence in the room was deafening. Marcus slumped back into his chair, his earlier bravado completely deflated. There's something else the board should know, I continued, opening a new folder. 3 months ago, Tech Global Corporation approached us about acquiring our technology. Marcus negotiated a preliminary offer of $100 million. Several board members straightened up. $100 million was more than double our current valuation. However, I continued, since I own all the core patents, any acquisition would require my explicit consent. Marcus forgot to mention that during his negotiations, Robert Chin's eyes widened. Marcus, is this true? You negotiated a deal without securing the intellectual property rights? Marcus's face had gone completely white. I thought. You thought you could sell technology you don't own, I finished. Just like you thought you could take credit for innovations you didn't create. I pulled out my phone and opened the email app. In fact, I received this message from Tech Global's CEO this morning. I read aloud. Ms. Martinez, after reviewing the patent filings you forwarded, we're prepared to discuss a direct acquisition of your intellectual property. Given your sole ownership of the core technology, we see no need to involve other parties in these negotiations. The board members exchanged glances. The implications were clear. Tech Global was offering to buy me out directly, cutting Marcus and potentially the entire company out of the deal. Julia, Patricia Williams said carefully, what are your intentions regarding this acquisition offer? I closed my laptop and gathered the patents back into their folder. That depends on this board. Are you interested in continuing to work with someone who truly understands the technology? Or would you prefer to stick with a partner who dismisses the inventor as just the silent money? Marcus finally found his voice. Julia, you can't do this. We built this company together. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Together? Marcus, I built the technology that powers every product we sell. I developed the algorithms that generate every dollar of revenue. I created the intellectual property that makes this company valuable. What exactly did we build together? The business relationships are based entirely on my technology, I interrupted. Our clients don't care about your MBA or your sales presentations. They care about predictive analytics that actually work. And those analytics exist because I spent 12 years developing the mathematical models that make them possible. I stood up, closing my briefcase with a decisive snap. I'm calling an emergency board meeting for next week. We'll be voting on a new corporate structure that accurately reflects intellectual property ownership and technical contributions. Board member David Ken raised his hand. Julia, before you go, could you clarify something? If you own all the core patents, what prevents you from simply licensing the technology to a different company? Marcus's eyes went wide with panic. He clearly hadn't considered this possibility. Nothing, I said simply. The patents are in my name. I could license them exclusively to Tech Global tomorrow and leave Marcus with a company that has no technology to sell. You wouldn't, Marcus whispered. I looked at him directly for the first time since placing the patents on the table. 2 hours ago, I wouldn't have considered it. But then someone who's never written a line of code told me I should leave technology decisions to people who understand technology. The irony was perfect. Marcus had spent 3 years positioning himself as the technical visionary while dismissing me as a passive investor. Now the board was learning that he understood about as much about our technology as a random person on the street. The emergency meeting is scheduled for next Tuesday, I announced. I'll be presenting a comprehensive review of intellectual property ownership, technical contributions, and future development roadmap. Anyone who's interested in understanding what actually makes this company valuable is welcome to attend. I walked toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Marcus? The next time you want to explain technology to someone, you might want to start by learning what an algorithm actually does. The door closed behind me with a soft click, leaving Marcus to face a room full of investors who now understood that their golden boy knew absolutely nothing about the technology that made their investment valuable. As I walked through the hallway toward my office, I pulled out my phone. 3 missed calls from Tech Global's acquisition team. They were eager to discuss terms for a direct purchase of my patents. The preliminary numbers they'd mentioned were staggering, enough to make the $100 million Marcus had negotiated look like pocket change. But selling wasn't necessarily my goal. I'd spent 12 years developing this technology, and I wasn't ready to hand it over to a corporation that might not appreciate its full potential. What I wanted was recognition, respect, and most importantly, control over the work that had consumed more than a decade of my life. My office was exactly as I'd left it that morning. 2 whiteboards covered in mathematical equations, 3 monitors displaying real-time system performance data, and shelves lined with technical manuals and research papers. This was where the real work happened. This was where innovations were born. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. The same battered ThinkPad that had witnessed every breakthrough, every late-night debugging session, every moment of inspiration that led to our current success. Marcus had always encouraged me to upgrade to something more professional-looking, but I preferred tools that prioritized function over form. My email inbox was full of messages. 3 from reporters who'd somehow gotten wind of the board meeting drama. 5 from potential investors interested in discussing partnerships. And 1 from my patent attorney confirming that all my intellectual property filings were secure and up to date. The last message was from Dr. Elizabeth Chen, my former PhD advisor at MIT. She'd been following Innovate Tech's progress and wanted to congratulate me on the recent innovations in predictive analytics. Her message included a link to a research paper that mentioned my work as a breakthrough in applied machine learning. I smiled reading her words. Dr. Chen understood the technical complexity of what I'd accomplished. She appreciated the mathematical elegance of algorithms that could process millions of variables and generate accurate predictions about complex business scenarios. She recognized the years of work that went into developing technology that Marcus dismissed as technical minutiae. A knock at my door interrupted my thoughts. Patricia Williams stood in the doorway, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Julia, do you have a few minutes? I think we need to talk." I gestured to the chair across from my desk. Patricia had been one of our earliest board members, invested not just financially but emotionally in the company's success. She'd also been one of the few people who consistently asked about the technical side of our products. "That was quite a revelation in there," she said, settling into the chair. "I have to admit, I never realized the extent of your technical contributions." "Most people don't," I replied. "Marcus has been very effective at positioning himself as the technology expert while keeping me in the background." Patricia was quiet for a moment, studying the equations on my whiteboards. "Julia, can I ask you something directly? Are you planning to leave the company?" It was a fair question. After 3 years of watching Marcus take credit for my work, the temptation to walk away was strong. Tech Global's offer would set me up financially for life, and I could start fresh with a new company where my contributions would be properly recognized from the beginning. "I haven't decided," I said honestly. "It depends on whether this board is willing to acknowledge reality, or if they prefer to continue living in Marcus's fantasy, where he's the technical genius." "The patents are pretty conclusive evidence," Patricia said, "but I'm concerned about the company's future. If you and Marcus can't work together—" "Patricia, let me be clear about something. I've never had a problem working with Marcus. The problem is Marcus's inability to work with me as an equal partner rather than a silent investor who should stay in her lane." I pulled up a document on my computer. "For 3 years, I've been trying to implement advanced features that would keep us ahead of competitors. Marcus has blocked every proposal, claiming they're too complicated for our target market." The document showed a detailed technical roadmap for features that would revolutionize predictive analytics, real-time learning algorithms, adaptive neural networks, quantum computing integration, innovations that could establish Innovatech as the undisputed leader in artificial intelligence applications. "These features would triple our market value," I explained. "But Marcus refuses to support development because he doesn't understand the technology well enough to sell it to clients." Patricia studied the roadmap carefully. "This is incredibly sophisticated. How long would implementation take?" "With proper resources, 18 months for the full suite. But I'd need complete technical authority. No more having my recommendations overruled by someone who thinks machine learning is too complicated for business applications." "What would you need from the board?" I'd been thinking about this question for months. Recognition as Chief Technology Officer with final authority over all technical decisions, a development budget appropriate for the innovations we're planning, and Marcus either accepts a reduced role focused purely on sales, or he can find another company to misrepresent his expertise to. Patricia nodded slowly. "Those seem like reasonable requests, given what we learned today." After she left, I spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing patent filings and technical documentation. Every algorithm, every innovation, every breakthrough that made Innovatech valuable could be traced back to my work. Marcus had contributed sales presentations and marketing materials, but the core technology that generated our revenue existed entirely because of my expertise. The next morning brought a steady stream of board members to my office. David Kim wanted to understand the technical roadmap. Robert Chen asked detailed questions about patent protection and intellectual property licensing. Even some of our major investors scheduled calls to discuss the company's future direction. Everyone, it seemed, was suddenly very interested in understanding the technology they'd been investing in for 3 years. Marcus was notably absent from these conversations. According to his assistant, he'd called in sick and wouldn't be in the office for the rest of the week, probably strategizing with lawyers about how to minimize the damage from his public humiliation. On Thursday, I received a formal letter from Marcus's attorney. It claimed that the patents should be considered joint intellectual property since they were developed while we were business partners. The legal argument was weak. The timestamps clearly showed that most of the technology predated our partnership, but it confirmed that Marcus was planning to fight rather than accept reality. I forwarded the letter to my own attorney with a note. Please prepare a comprehensive response documenting the timeline of intellectual property development. Include all relevant email records, code repositories, and technical documentation that establish sole ownership. By Friday, the emergency board meeting had been rescheduled for the following Monday. Marcus's legal maneuvering had convinced the board that they needed to thoroughly review all intellectual property claims before making any decisions about company leadership. That was fine with me. The more closely they examined the evidence, the clearer it would become that Marcus's contributions were purely superficial, while mine formed the foundation of everything valuable about Innovatech. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that matched my mood as I prepared for what would likely be a contentious board meeting. I'd spent the weekend compiling a comprehensive presentation that documented every aspect of my technical contributions, from the original research papers that inspired our algorithms to the most recent innovations that kept us ahead of competitors. The boardroom was packed when I arrived. All 7 board members, both company attorneys, Marcus looking uncomfortable in an expensive suit, and a technical consultant the board had hired to evaluate our intellectual property claims. Before we begin, announced Board Chairman David Kim, I want to establish that today's meeting is focused purely on factual review of technical contributions and intellectual property ownership. We're not here to assign blame or make emotional arguments. Marcus shifted in his seat. He'd clearly been hoping for a forum where he could charm the board with his sales skills rather than defend his technical claims with evidence. Julia, would you please present your documentation? I opened my laptop and began the presentation I had spent years preparing in my head, even if I'd only put it together over the weekend. The evidence was overwhelming. Patent after patent, all filed under my name. Thousands of lines of original code, all documented with my digital signatures. Research papers and technical publications, all citing my innovations as breakthrough developments in machine learning. The technical consultant took extensive notes, occasionally asking for clarification about specific algorithms or development timelines. His questions demonstrated a deep understanding of computer science that made Marcus visibly uncomfortable. Ms. Martinez, the consultant said during a break, the sophistication of this work is remarkable. The mathematical complexity alone would require years of specialized training. How long did you spend developing these algorithms? The foundation was laid during my doctoral research, I replied, but the commercial applications took approximately 8 years of full-time development. Marcus couldn't stay silent any longer. This is all very impressive, but it ignores the business development that made commercialization possible. Technology without market strategy is worthless. The consultant looked at Marcus with interest. Mr. Chen, could you describe your specific contributions to the technical development process? Marcus stammered through a response about user interface design and client feedback integration. Valuable contributions? Certainly, but hardly the kind of foundational work that justified his claims to technical leadership. And the core algorithms? The consultant pressed. What role did you play in their development? Marcus's face flushed. I provided strategic guidance about commercial applications. Strategic guidance, the consultant repeated. Could you explain the mathematical basis for any of the predictive models? Silence. Marcus stared at the table, finally confronted with the undeniable reality that he understood virtually nothing about the technology that made our company valuable. The board voted unanimously to restructure the company with me as Chief Technology Officer and sole owner of all intellectual property licensing rights. Marcus would retain a position as Vice President of Sales, but with no authority over technical decisions or product development. As board members filed out the conference room, Marcus approached me with an expression I'd never seen before. Humility. Julia, I owe you an apology. I got caught up in the success and forgot who made it possible. I looked at him for a long moment. Marcus, I don't need an apology. I need a partner who respects expertise and recognizes contributions. If you can do that, we can build something amazing together. If not, Tech Global is still interested in acquiring my patents. He nodded slowly. I understand. It won't happen again. 6 months later, Innovatech released the advanced features I'd been developing for years. The market response was overwhelming. Our client base tripled, our revenue increased by 400%, and 3 major tech publications featured our innovations as breakthrough developments in artificial intelligence. Marcus, to his credit, focused on what he did best: building client relationships and presenting our technology in terms that business leaders could understand. He never again questioned my technical decisions or suggested that I should leave technology to the experts. And when reporters asked about the company's remarkable growth, Marcus always made sure to credit the brilliant innovations of our Chief Technology Officer. Finally, the right person was getting credit for the right work. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. Sometimes it's simply forcing them to acknowledge the truth they've been trying to hide. In a world where technical expertise often gets overshadowed by smooth sales presentations, there's something deeply satisfying about proving that innovation, not manipulation, creates lasting value. The patents remain in my name. The technology continues to evolve under my direction, and Marcus has learned that understanding technology means more than being able to pronounce artificial intelligence in client meetings. It turns out that when you actually know what you're talking about, you don't need to silence other people to prove your expertise. You just need to let your work speak for itself. Elizabeth, we need to discuss the living arrangements now that your father is gone. Patricia's voice carried that familiar tone of false concern mixed with barely concealed authority as she approached me in the kitchen where I was arranging funeral flowers. The house was full of mourners paying their respects to Dad, but my stepmother had clearly decided this was the perfect time for family business. I continued cutting stems and placing white lilies in the crystal vase Dad had given me for my college graduation. The same vase Patricia had tried to convince him was too expensive for a stepdaughter's gift 8 years ago. My hands remained steady despite the conversation I knew was coming. Of course, Patricia, though I think today might not be the most appropriate time for practical matters. She smoothed her black dress and checked her reflection in the kitchen window. Even at Dad's funeral, Patricia managed to look like she was attending a charity gala rather than mourning her husband of 12 years. Her makeup was flawless, her hair professionally styled, her jewelry expensive but tasteful. The picture of a grieving widow who somehow looked better than most people did on their best days. I disagree, she said, leaning against the granite counter Dad had installed when I was in high school. Delay only makes these conversations more difficult. We're adults here. Through the kitchen doorway, I could see my half-siblings holding court in the living room. Austin, 22, and fresh out of college with a business degree he barely earned, was explaining investment strategies to Dad's old friends from the engineering firm. Melanie, 24, and perpetually between jobs, was describing her latest plans to start a lifestyle blog to anyone who would listen. Both of them had inherited Patricia's talent for presenting confidence in place of competence. Both had also inherited her belief that the world owed them everything they wanted simply because they wanted it. "What specifically did you want to discuss?" I asked, though I already knew. Patricia had been dropping hints for months about how expensive it was to maintain Dad's house. How much more practical it would be for everyone if living arrangements were optimized. "Well," she began, her voice taking on that artificially sweet tone she used when she was about to say something cruel. "This house is quite large for one person, and with Austin planning to get married next year, and Melanie needing a stable base while she establishes her career." I placed another lily in the vase, taking my time to get the arrangement just right. Dad had taught me patience during the 3 years he battled cancer. Patience with insurance companies, with doctors, with well-meaning relatives who offered advice about treatments they didn't understand. Most importantly, patience with Patricia, who spent those 3 years positioning herself and her children for the inevitable. "Are you suggesting I move out?" I asked calmly. "I'm suggesting we be realistic about everyone's needs." Patricia pulled out one of the kitchen bar stools and sat down, clearly settling in for a longer conversation. "You have your career, your independence. Austin and Melanie are still finding their footing. This house would give them the stability they need. My career, as if being a senior partner at one of the city's most prestigious law firms was some kind of hobby I could relocate anywhere. As if the 15 years I'd spent building my practice, the clients who depended on my expertise, the junior partners I mentored, were all easily transferable." "I see," I said, moving to the next vase. "And where exactly would I be finding this career-focused independence?" "There are lovely condominiums downtown, much more suitable for a single professional woman. Less maintenance, better security, closer to your office." I almost smiled at the word suitable. Patricia had strong opinions about what was suitable for various types of people. Stepdaughters, apparently, were suitable for downtown condominiums rather than family homes where they'd grown up. "That's an interesting perspective," I replied. "Have you discussed this with Austin and Melanie?" "Of course. They're both very concerned about your well-being. Living alone in such a large house can't be healthy for someone your age." Someone my age. I was 35, hardly a spinster requiring intervention. But in Patricia's worldview, unmarried women over 30 were objects of pity who needed guidance from more successful wives and mothers. Through the doorway, I watched Austin gesture expansively while explaining something to Mr. Henderson from Dad's old firm. Austin had Dad's height and Patricia's confidence, but none of Dad's substance. He'd graduated college with a 2.3 GPA and no job prospects, but Patricia had convinced Dad that Austin just needed time to find his passion. Melanie was showing her phone to a group of church ladies, probably displaying her latest Instagram posts. She'd been finding herself for 6 years since high school, starting and abandoning various creative pursuits whenever they required actual work. "I appreciate your concern," I said, "but I'm quite comfortable here. This is my home." Patricia's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The artificial sweetness hardened into something more recognizable. "Elizabeth, I think you're misunderstanding the situation. This house belonged to your father, and now it belongs to his family. I am his family. You're his stepdaughter. Austin and Melanie are his blood. There it was. The distinction Patricia had been carefully avoiding for 12 years while she needed Dad's support for her children's endless expenses. When Austin needed college tuition, I was family. When Melanie needed a car, I was family. When Patricia wanted expensive renovations, I was family. But now that Dad was gone, I was just the stepdaughter who needed to make room for the real children. I see, I said quietly. And you've determined that blood relations supersedes 15 years of residence here. I've determined that practical considerations matter more than sentiment. Austin needs space for his fiancée when they marry. Melanie needs a quiet environment to focus on building her business. You need independence and the freedom to build your own life. My own life. As if I hadn't been building my own life for years while also caring for Dad through his illness, managing his medical care, handling his legal affairs, and watching Patricia systematically position herself and her children as his primary beneficiaries. That's very thoughtful of you to consider everyone's needs so carefully, I said. I assume you've also considered the practical aspects of this arrangement. Patricia waved her hand dismissively. Details can be worked out. The important thing is that we all understand what's best for the family. I finished the second flower arrangement and turned to face her directly. Patricia, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you remember 3 years ago when Dad updated his will after his first cancer diagnosis? Her carefully composed expression flickered. Vaguely. He was very sick, making arrangements. He was very thorough, actually. He spent months with his attorney making sure everything was properly documented and legally sound. Elizabeth, I don't think this is the time to discuss legal technicalities. When would be a better time? After I've moved to one of those suitable downtown condominiums. Patricia stood up from the bar stool, her posture becoming more rigid. I think you're being deliberately difficult about a very straightforward family matter. Family matters often involve legal technicalities, don't they? Especially when they concern property ownership and inheritance rights. The house was your father's. Now it belongs to his widow and children. I nodded slowly. His widow and children. That's an interesting way to phrase it. Before Patricia could respond, Austin appeared in the kitchen doorway. Mom, people are starting to leave. Should we do the speech now? Patricia glanced at me, then back at Austin. Yes, I think it's time. I followed them into the living room where the remaining guests had gathered. Perhaps 30 people, mostly Dad's colleagues from the engineering firm, neighbors, and church friends. Patricia positioned herself near the fireplace, with Austin and Melanie flanking her like bodyguards. Thank you all for being here today to honor Robert's memory, Patricia began, her voice carrying the perfect note of dignified grief. He would have been so moved by the love and support you've shown our family during this difficult time. Our family. I noticed how smoothly she positioned herself and her children as the primary mourners while I stood apart near the kitchen doorway. As we begin the process of healing and moving forward, Patricia continued, we want you to know that Robert's legacy will live on through the values he instilled in Austin and Melanie. His children will carry his memory in everything they do. His children. Again, the careful exclusion wrapped in seemingly inclusive language. Robert was a man who believed in family above all else, Patricia said, her voice growing stronger. He worked hard to provide for us, to give us a foundation we could build on. This house, his life's work, everything he accomplished was for his family. I watched the faces of Dad's friends and colleagues. Mr. Henderson looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Chen from next door kept glancing at me with concern. They all knew I'd been the one caring for Dad during his illness, managing his affairs, making sure his wishes were respected. Now, Patricia continued, we have some difficult decisions to make about maintaining Robert's legacy. The practical realities of keeping his memory alive while moving forward as a family. She paused, looking directly at me. This house has been the center of our family for so many years. Austin and Melanie grew up here, and it's important that they continue to have that foundation as they build their own families. I saw where this was going. A public announcement designed to pressure me into compliance through social expectation. Elizabeth has been wonderful, Patricia said, her tone suggesting charity rather than gratitude. She's been like a daughter to Robert, and we're so grateful for everything she's done. But we all understand that it's time for her to spread her wings, to build her own life independent of the family nest. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. The manipulation was transparent to anyone who knew our family dynamics. So, Patricia said, her voice taking on a tone of finality, this house belongs to my real children now. Elizabeth will be transitioning to her own place, giving Austin and Melanie the space they need to honor their father's memory. The room fell quiet. Austin nodded approvingly. Melanie smiled, that self-satisfied expression she perfected since childhood whenever she got something she wanted. Pack your things and leave by Sunday, Patricia concluded, looking at me with the expression of someone who just solved a complex problem. It's what Robert would have wanted. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Dad's friends and colleagues stared at their hands, at the floor, anywhere but at the family drama unfolding in front of them. I walked calmly across the living room to the kitchen, opened the drawer where Dad kept important documents, and retrieved a manila folder I'd placed there that morning. The same drawer where he'd always kept insurance papers, utility bills, and legal documents that needed to be easily accessible. Returning to the living room, I placed the folder on the coffee table in front of Patricia. The gesture was quiet, simple, completely without drama. Before everyone leaves, I said calmly, there's something you should see. Patricia looked at the folder suspiciously. Elizabeth, what is this? I opened the folder and pulled out the top document. This is the property deed for this house, updated 3 years ago when Dad revised his estate planning. Patricia's confident expression began to waver. I don't understand what you're trying to prove. The deed shows current ownership of the property. I held up the document so the guests could see the official county seal and legal formatting. Would you like me to read the owner's name? The room was completely silent now. Austin stopped his self-satisfied nodding. Melanie's smile disappeared. Elizabeth Margaret Harrison. I read aloud. Sole owner as of March 15th, 3 years ago. Patricia snatched the document from my hands, her eyes scanning the legal language frantically. This can't be right. Robert owned this house. Dad transferred ownership to me when he was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer, I explained to the room. His attorney recommended it as part of comprehensive estate planning to avoid probate complications and ensure property security. Patricia was still staring at the deed, her face cycling through expressions of confusion, anger, and panic. But he didn't tell me. He told me he was protecting his most important investment, I said quietly. This house and the person who had actually been taking care of it. Austin stepped forward, his earlier confidence completely gone. This has to be some kind of mistake. I pulled out another document. This is the certificate of title transfer, signed by Dad and notarized by his attorney. Would you like to see the attorney's contact information to verify authenticity? Melanie finally found her voice. But Mom said we were inheriting the house. Your mother made an assumption, I replied. The house wasn't part of Dad's estate because he'd already transferred ownership 3 years ago. Patricia was reading the deed more carefully now, and I could see the moment she understood what she was looking at. Legal language was clear when you took time to actually read it. Elizabeth, she said, her voice much smaller than it had been during her speech, surely we can work something out. Robert intended for all of us to benefit from this property. Did he? I asked. Because when he transferred ownership to me, he was very specific about his reasoning. Would you like me to share what he told his attorney? The guests were watching this exchange like spectators at a tennis match. Mr. Henderson had pulled out his phone, probably texting his wife about the drama unfolding at Robert Harrison's funeral reception. Dad told his attorney that he was transferring the house to the person who had demonstrated the greatest responsibility and commitment to the family, I continued. The person who had been managing household finances, coordinating his medical care, and ensuring that family obligations were met. Patricia's perfectly composed facade was cracking. I was dealing with grief, supporting the children through a difficult time. You were planning their futures, I corrected. Which is understandable, but Dad was planning too. I pulled out a third document. This is a letter Dad wrote to me when he signed the property transfer. Would you like me to read it? Elizabeth, please, Patricia said quickly. Let's discuss this privately. I think we've moved past private discussions, I replied. You made your announcement publicly. The response should be equally public. I unfolded the letter Dad had written in his careful engineer's handwriting. Elizabeth, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone and someone has challenged your ownership of our home. I want everyone to understand why I made this decision. The room was dead silent now. Even Austin and Melanie had stopped their whispering. For 15 years, Elizabeth has been the stability in our family. When I married Patricia, Elizabeth welcomed her and her children with grace and maturity beyond her years. When I got sick, Elizabeth managed every aspect of my care while maintaining her demanding career. When bills needed paying, Elizabeth paid them. When decisions needed making, Elizabeth made them. Patricia had gone very pale. The letter was destroying the narrative she'd constructed about family hierarchy and blood relations. Austin and Melanie are good children, I continued reading, but they have never demonstrated the responsibility or commitment that homeownership requires. Patricia has many wonderful qualities, but practical management is not among them. Elizabeth has proven herself to be the true keeper of our family's foundation. I folded the letter carefully. He ended by saying that he hoped his decision would be respected, and that anyone who couldn't accept it was welcome to find alternative living arrangements. The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia sank into the nearest chair, looking like someone who'd just been told their lottery ticket was a fake. Austin stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. This isn't fair. We grew up here too. You're absolutely right, I said calmly. You did grow up here, in the house where I've lived for 15 years, paying property taxes, maintenance costs, and utilities, while you focused on your education and career development. But we're family, Melanie protested. Yes, we are, which is why you're welcome to continue living here under the same arrangement you've always had, as my guests. Patricia's head snapped up. Your guests? Patricia, you just announced that I should pack my things and leave by Sunday. You declared that this house belongs to your real children now. But since I own the house, I think we need to revisit those living arrangements. The legal training that had made me a successful attorney was serving me well now. Keep emotion out of it. Focus on facts. Let the other side reveal their true motivations through their own words. I have a proposal, I continued. Austin, you're welcome to continue living here rent-free until your wedding, as originally planned. Melanie, you can stay until you establish stable employment and can afford your own place. Patricia. I paused, looking at my stepmother who had just tried to evict me from my own home at my father's funeral. Patricia, you have until the end of the month to decide whether you can accept living in a house owned by your stepdaughter or whether you'd prefer to find one of those suitable downtown condominiums you mentioned. The guests began quietly gathering their coats and purses. The entertainment was over, and they clearly wanted to escape before the family drama escalated further. Mrs. Chen approached me as she prepared to leave. Elizabeth, your father would be proud of how you handled this. Mr. Henderson shook my hand. If you need anything, legal advice, references, anything at all, please call. One by one, Dad's friends and colleagues offered their support before leaving. It was clear who they saw as Robert Harrison's true successor. After the last guest left, the four of us stood in the living room that had just witnessed Patricia's public humiliation. The flower arrangements I'd made that morning looked strangely cheerful in the aftermath of the confrontation. Elizabeth, Patricia said finally, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I don't think there has been, I replied. You were very clear about your position. I'm just explaining mine. Austin was still studying the property deed like it might change if he stared at it long enough. This doesn't make sense. Why wouldn't Dad tell us he was transferring the house? He did tell you, I said. 3 years ago, when he called a family meeting to discuss his estate planning. You were busy with college, and Melanie was traveling in Europe. Neither of you attended. Melanie's face flushed. We didn't know it was important. Dad's legal affairs weren't important enough to interrupt your spring break plans. Patricia stood up abruptly. That's enough. Elizabeth, we need to discuss this reasonably. We tried reasonable discussion in the kitchen. I reminded her. You informed me that I needed to pack my things and leave by Sunday to make room for your real children. How exactly would you like to make that reasonable? I was emotional, dealing with grief. You were strategic, positioning your children for maximum benefit. Unfortunately, you didn't verify property ownership before making your announcement. I walked to the window and looked out at the garden Dad and I had planted together over the years. The roses he'd helped me choose, the fruit trees we planted for privacy, the vegetables patch where he taught me about soil composition and drainage. Here's what's going to happen, I said, turning back to face them. Austin, your wedding plans don't change. You can continue living here until then. Melanie, you have 6 months to find stable employment and your own housing. Patricia, you have 30 days to decide whether you want to live peacefully in my house or find alternative arrangements. Your house, Patricia repeated bitterly. My house, I confirmed. The house Dad legally transferred to me because he trusted me to reserve what he built. Austin was still processing the implications. But what about inheritance? The will? The will covers Dad's personal property, savings, and investments. The house was already mine, so it wasn't part of his estate. I pulled out one final document. Here's the breakdown of Dad's actual estate. Patricia inherits his savings and retirement accounts. You and Melanie inherit his investment portfolio. I inherit his personal property and continue owning the house I've owned for 3 years. Patricia snatched the estate summary and read it quickly. Her face went through several expressions as she realized that Dad's liquid assets, while comfortable, weren't nearly enough to buy another house like this one. This is manipulative, she said finally. Robert was sick, probably not thinking clearly. Dad was an engineer, Patricia, He thought clearly right up until the end. His attorney will confirm that he was completely competent when he made these decisions. I'm calling a lawyer, Austin announced. That's your right, I replied. But you should know that Dad's attorney specifically documented his reasoning for the property transfer. He anticipated that there might be challenges. I gathered the documents back into their folder. The attorney's contact information is in Dad's desk if you want to verify anything I've told you. Melanie was crying now, probably realizing that her comfortable lifestyle was about to change dramatically. This isn't what Dad would have wanted. Melanie, Dad lived with his decision for 3 years. If he'd wanted to change it, he had plenty of opportunities. Patricia was staring at the floor, her earlier confidence completely shattered. Where am I supposed to go? That's not my problem to solve, I said quietly. 3 hours ago, you told me to pack my things and leave by Sunday. You declared that this house belongs to your real children. You made your position very clear. I was upset, grieving. You were calculating. Just like you calculated that Dad would leave everything to you and your children. Just like you calculated that I would quietly accept whatever arrangement you decided was suitable. I walked toward the stairs leading to my bedroom. I'm going to rest now. It's been a long day. Feel free to use the kitchen if you need anything. Elizabeth, wait. Patricia called. We need to resolve this. I paused at the bottom of the stairs. Patricia, there's nothing to resolve. I own this house. Dad intended for me to own this house. You attempted to evict me at his funeral. Those are the facts. But we're family, she said desperately. Yes, we are. Which is why I'm not evicting you immediately like you tried to do to me. You have 30 days to adjust to the new reality. I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, leaving Patricia, Austin, and Melanie to contemplate the difference between assumed authority and actual legal ownership. From my bedroom window, I could see neighbors' houses where I'd lived my entire adult life. The community where I'd built relationships, established roots, created the stability Dad had valued so highly. Patricia had calculated that grief and social pressure would force me to accept her version of family hierarchy. She'd assumed that being the biological mother gave her authority over the stepdaughter. She'd been wrong about everything except my commitment to preserving what Dad had built. Over the next 3 weeks, the household dynamics shifted dramatically. Austin spent most of his time at his fiancée's apartment, avoiding the tension. Melanie alternated between sulking and making half-hearted attempts to find employment. Patricia maintained icy politeness while clearly hoping I would change my mind about the ownership arrangement. On day 28 of her 30-day deadline, Patricia knocked on my bedroom door. Elizabeth, may I come in? I was reading case files for Monday's court appearance, but I set them aside. Of course. She entered tentatively, no longer carrying herself with the authority she displayed at Dad's funeral. I found an apartment downtown. One of those suitable condominiums I mentioned. I hope it works well for you. Elizabeth, I owe you an apology. I was wrong to assume that the house would automatically be mine. I was wrong to try to evict you. And I was wrong to dismiss your role in this family. I studied her carefully. The apology sounded genuine, but Patricia had always been skilled at saying what people wanted to hear when it served her purposes. I appreciate that, Patricia. Would you consider allowing me to stay? I could pay rent, contribute to household expenses. I was quiet for a long moment. The practical side of me recognized that Patricia's rent payments would help with the considerable costs of maintaining the house. But the protective side remembered her standing in the living room declaring that the house belonged to her real children. Patricia, can I ask you something? Of course. If our situations were reversed, If you owned this house and I had tried to evict you at Dad's funeral, would you be offering me a chance to stay as a tenant?" She was quiet for a long time. Finally, she shook her head. "Probably not." "Then you understand my position." "I do." She stood to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, Robert was right to trust you with this house. You've been a better daughter to him than I was a wife, and a better family member than Austin and Melanie have been siblings." After she left, I returned to my case files. Monday's court appearance was a complex property dispute, the kind of case that required careful attention to legal documentation and ownership rights. The same skills that had protected my own home were now serving my clients. Patricia moved out 2 days later with minimal drama. Austin stayed until his wedding 6 months later, maintaining polite distance, but gradually warming to the reality that I wasn't the villain in his family's story. Melanie found a job and an apartment, discovering that independence could be empowering rather than terrifying. A year later, I received a letter from Patricia. She'd settled into her downtown condominium and was volunteering at a literacy center, finding purpose in helping others rather than managing family dynamics. She thanked me for forcing her to build an independent life and admitted that she'd been trying to recreate her first marriage where financial security came through managing her husband's assets rather than earning her own. Austin and his wife visited regularly, bringing their newborn daughter to the house where 4 generations of the family had now lived. The baby's nursery was in Austin's old room, surrounded by the same walls where Dad had read bedtime stories and taught basic math concepts. Melanie called every few weeks, updating me on her job and her new relationship. She discovered that she actually enjoyed working when the job matched her interests, and that earning her own money felt better than depending on family support. The house remained exactly as Dad had intended, a foundation for family, maintained by the person who understood both its practical and emotional value. The roses bloomed each spring, the fruit trees produced their annual harvest, and the garden provided the same peace it had offered Dad during his final years. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies. Sometimes it's simply refusing to be displaced by people who mistake entitlement for ownership. Dad had spent 3 years ensuring that his home would be protected by the person who truly understood its worth. In the end, Patricia's assumption about blood relations versus chosen family had been her downfall. Dad had chosen his successor based on demonstrated commitment rather than biological connection. The legal documents I placed on the coffee table that day weren't just proof of ownership. They were proof that love and loyalty create stronger bonds than genetics and manipulation. The house stands as Dad intended, owned by the daughter who earned it through 15 years of responsibility, protected by the same legal expertise that now helps other families navigate complex property disputes. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply refusing to let entitled people take what they haven't earned. And when new neighbors ask about the beautiful Victorian house with the amazing garden, I tell them it's been in my family for over 20 years. Because family, I've learned, is defined by commitment and care, not by blood and assumption. The quarterly merger proposal spread across my desk required the kind of complex financial analysis that had made me the youngest partner in Morrison & Associates' 90-year history. Numbers that would reshape 2 Fortune 500 companies, employment for thousands of workers, and investment returns that could fund entire pension systems. Just another Tuesday morning in corporate law, where billion-dollar decisions were made between coffee refills. My assistant knocked on the office door, interrupting my review of the antitrust implications outlined in Section 47. "Ms. Reynolds, your mother-in-law called. She wants to discuss the anniversary party arrangements." I set down my red pen and checked the time. Helen Parker Montgomery had been calling daily for 3 weeks about our 5th wedding anniversary celebration, micromanaging everything from the floral arrangements to the guest list. Most of her suggestions involved demonstrating why her son David had married beneath his social station. Did she mention anything specific? Something about upgrading the wine selection. She said the vintage you chose might not meet the expectations of the Montgomery family's social circle. The Montgomery family's social circle. A collection of old money families who measured success by how many generations their wealth had survived, rather than how much value they created. David's family had built their fortune in railroad investments during the 1920s and had been coasting on inherited prestige ever since. My intercom buzzed. Also, your husband called. He'll be working late again tonight. The Harrison Industries audit is taking longer than expected. David had been working extended hours for 3 months, ever since his accounting firm landed the massive audit contract. Helen blamed me for his demanding schedule, suggesting that a proper wife would ensure her husband prioritized family obligations over career advancement. The irony was rich. Helen spent her days organizing charity lunches and country club committees, while I managed legal strategies that affected international markets. But in her worldview, my career was a distraction from my real purpose of supporting David's success and producing Montgomery grandchildren. I returned to the merger documents, analyzing regulatory compliance requirements and potential shareholder conflicts. This deal would be featured in every major business publication, setting precedents for corporate restructuring that would influence similar transactions for years. The kind of work that required expertise Helen would never understand or appreciate. By 6 that evening, I was reviewing final contract revisions when David finally arrived home. Our house in Beacon Hill was elegant but understated, the kind of property that conveyed success without ostentation. Helen had criticized our choice, preferring something more traditional that would reflect the Montgomery family's established taste. "How was your day?" David asked, loosening his tie as he collapsed into the leather chair across from my desk. "Productive. We finalized the Morrison-Hartford merger terms. The closing should happen next month." David's eyes lit up. He might not fully understand the technical aspects of my work, but he appreciated its significance. "That's huge, Victoria. Congratulations." "Thank you. How's the Harrison audit progressing?" "Slowly. There are some irregularities in their subsidiary accounting that need careful review. I'll probably be working weekends for the next month." I could already hear Helen's reaction to that news. More complaints about David's demanding schedule, more subtle suggestions that I should convince him to prioritize family time over professional obligations. "Speaking of family time," David continued, "Mother called about the anniversary party. She has some additional thoughts about the arrangements." "Such as?" "She thinks we should serve champagne instead of wine during the toasts. Something about the symbolic importance of celebrating milestone marriages appropriately." Helen's symbolic improvements always seemed to involve more expensive choices that would demonstrate proper Montgomery family standards. Champagne instead of wine, orchids instead of roses, musicians instead of a playlist. "Whatever makes her happy," I said, though we both knew nothing would make Helen completely happy. My existence in David's life was a constant reminder that he'd chosen love over strategic marriage within their social circle. "Victoria, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever regret not having a traditional wedding?" Mother mentioned that some of her friends still talk about how quickly we got married, how simple the ceremony was. I looked at my husband, really looked at him. David was genuinely kind, supportive of my career, and completely oblivious to his mother's systematic campaign to undermine our marriage. He had no idea that Helen regularly suggested he'd settle for someone beneath his station. "I regret nothing about our wedding," I said firmly. "We marry for the right reasons, and that's what matters." What David didn't know was that I'd insisted on a prenuptial agreement before we married. Not because I doubted our relationship, but because I understood exactly what kind of family I was marrying into. Helen's initial reaction to our engagement had made it clear that she viewed me as a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent family member. The prenup negotiations had been handled by my personal attorney, separate from David's family lawyers. Helen didn't know it existed, probably assuming that David would never consider such an arrangement with someone from my modest background. She was wrong about many things, but especially about the balance of power in our marriage. The anniversary party was scheduled for Saturday evening in our home's garden. Helen had convinced David that a public venue would be too impersonal for such an important milestone, though I suspected she preferred the control that hosting at our house would give her. By Thursday, the preparations were in full swing. Helen arrived early that morning with her interior designer, rearranging furniture and replacing my carefully chosen flower arrangements with more elaborate alternatives. "Victoria, darling," she said, examining my dress selection hanging in the bedroom closet, "don't you think something more formal would be appropriate? This is a Montgomery family celebration, after all. A Montgomery family celebration. As if David and I were incidental guests at our own anniversary party. I think the dress I chose is perfectly appropriate, Helen." "Of course, dear. I just want everything to reflect well on David. You understand." I understood exactly what she meant. Helen wanted everything to demonstrate that David had maintained family standards despite his unfortunate choice in wives. "The Vanderbilts will be attending," Helen continued, "along with the Ashfords and the Whitman family. They're all very traditional about these matters." Traditional about these matters meant they were all very judgmental about David's marriage to someone whose father was a public school teacher rather than a trust fund manager. "I'm sure they'll find the celebration adequate," I replied. Helen's smile tightened. Adequate wasn't the impression she wanted to make on her social circle. She'd spent weeks planning an event that would prove David's marriage hadn't diminished his family's standing. Friday evening brought the final preparations. Catering staff arranged tables in the garden, while Helen supervised every detail with the intensity of a military commander. She transformed our intimate outdoor space into something resembling a country club formal event. "The flowers are perfect," she declared to the florist. "Exactly the level of elegance the Montgomery name requires." David appeared beside me as we watched his mother orchestrate the preparations. "She's really outdone herself this time. She certainly has strong opinions about how our anniversary should be celebrated. Mother just wants everything to be special for us." I didn't respond. Helen wanted everything to be special for David, with minimal consideration for my preferences or comfort. But David couldn't see the distinction because he'd grown up assuming that his happiness was everyone's primary concern. Saturday arrived with perfect weather and Helen's complete satisfaction with the arrangements. By 7 that evening, guests were arriving in expensive cars and designer clothing, exactly the audience Helen had curated to witness Montgomery family success. I greeted guests in the cocktail dress I'd originally selected, despite Helen's disapproving glances. Conversations flowed around topics like vacation homes in the Hamptons, children's private school placements, and investment strategies for preserving generational wealth. Victoria called Margaret Ashford, approaching with her husband Charles. "What a lovely celebration. You and David look so happy together." Margaret had always been polite to me, though her tone suggested surprise that David's unconventional marriage had lasted 5 years. Charles nodded approvingly while scanning the party arrangements with the eye of someone evaluating social status. "Thank you, Margaret. We're grateful to have friends like you celebrating with us." 5 years, Charles mused. Time really does fly. And you're both doing so well professionally. He said it with genuine warmth. But I noticed Helen approaching from across the garden with the purposeful stride that usually preceded her most pointed observations. "Charles, Margaret," Helen said, joining our conversation circle. "I'm so glad you could be here to celebrate David's anniversary. He's accomplished so much professionally, and it's wonderful to see him building on the Montgomery family legacy." David's anniversary. As if I were merely an observer rather than an equal participant in our marriage. "David has certainly established himself as one of the city's premier accountants," Margaret replied diplomatically. "The Harrison Industries audit is a tremendous opportunity," Helen continued. "Exactly the kind of high-profile work that establishes reputations in our social circle." Our social circle. Helen's careful language always excluded me from family achievements while including me in any potential embarrassments. More guests gathered as Helen warmed to her favorite topic, David's success and promising future. She discussed his career trajectory, his investment strategies, and his continued commitment to Montgomery family values. "Of course," she said, her voice carrying across the garden, "maintaining family standards becomes more challenging when marriages cross social boundaries. Some adjustments require more patience than others." The conversation around us quieted. Helen had perfected the art of delivering insults disguised as general observations, making it difficult to respond without appearing defensive. "Helen," I said calmly, "could you be more specific about which adjustments you're referring to?" She smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully maneuvered their opponent into an uncomfortable position. "Oh, nothing critical, dear. Just the natural learning curve that comes with adapting to established family expectations." David appeared at my side, sensing tension, but not understanding its source. "Mother, are you talking about work schedules again? Victoria and I have everything balanced perfectly." "I'm talking about broader compatibility issues, David. Some people naturally understand what's expected in families like ours, while others require more guidance." The circle of guests exchanged glances. Helen's meaning was transparent to everyone except David, who still believed his mother's criticisms were motivated by concern rather than prejudice. "What kind of guidance?" I asked, maintaining my professional composure despite the public nature of Helen's attack. "Well," Helen said, glancing around to ensure she had an adequate audience, "I think it's obvious that David deserves someone who truly complements his background and aspirations. Someone from a family that understands the responsibilities that come with the Montgomery name." The garden fell quieter as nearby conversations stopped. Helen had crossed from subtle disapproval into direct insult, publicly questioning my worthiness as David's wife at our own anniversary celebration. "Helen," David started, but she held up her hand. "Let me finish, darling. I've watched this marriage for 5 years, hoping that time would bridge the gap between your wife's background and our family's standards. But some differences are simply too fundamental to overcome." She turned to address me directly, her voice carrying the authority of someone delivering a final verdict. "You're not good enough for my son. He deserves someone from a better family, someone who can truly appreciate what the Montgomery name represents." The silence that followed was complete. 30 guests stood frozen in our garden, witnessing Helen's public declaration that I was unworthy of my own marriage. David's face had gone white with shock and embarrassment. "Mother," he whispered, You can't say things like that. I can say what everyone here is thinking, Helen replied. David, you're a Montgomery. You could have married anyone. Instead, you chose someone who will never truly fit into our world, no matter how hard she tries. I looked around at the faces of our guests. Some appeared embarrassed by Helen's cruelty. Others seemed curious about how I would respond to such a direct attack. All were waiting to see whether I would crumble under the public humiliation. Instead, I smiled calmly and walked toward our house. Victoria, where are you going? David called after me. To get something from the office, I replied. I'll be right back. I climbed the stairs to our home office where I kept important documents in a fireproof safe behind David's desk. Legal contracts, insurance policies, investment records, and the prenuptial agreement that Helen didn't know existed. The document was exactly where I'd filed it 5 years ago, in a folder marked Marriage Documents, Private. 27 pages of legal language that David's family attorney had helped draft, though he'd been sworn to confidentiality about its contents. I returned to the garden where guests were standing in uncomfortable silence while Helen basked in the satisfaction of having finally said what she'd been thinking for 5 years. Helen, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the garden, since you're concerned about David's future and family compatibility, I thought you might be interested in seeing this. I held up the prenuptial agreement for everyone to see. The legal document was bound in official blue covers with ribbons and seals that made its importance unmistakable. What is that? Helen asked, though her voice suggested she was beginning to understand that her moment of triumph might be premature. This is the prenuptial agreement David and I signed before our wedding, I announced to the stunned guests. The document that outlines exactly how our marriage protects the Montgomery family interests you're so concerned about. Helen's confident expression faltered. David didn't sign a prenuptial agreement. Actually, he did. At my insistence, not his. I opened the document to the section I'd memorized years ago. Section 12, subsection A. In the event of divorce initiated by either party, David Montgomery Parker retains sole ownership of all inherited family assets, including trust funds, real estate, and investment portfolios established prior to marriage. The guests were listening intently now, realizing they were witnessing something far more dramatic than a simple family argument. Section 12, subsection B, I continued, establishes that Victoria Reynolds Parker waives all claims to Montgomery family wealth, property, or business interests acquired through marriage. Helen was staring at the document like it might be fake. That's impossible. David would never. Section 15. I interrupted, turning to the inheritance provisions, specifically addresses family legacy protection. Would you like me to read that section aloud? David stepped forward, his face a mixture of confusion and concern. Victoria, what are you doing? I'm addressing your mother's concerns about family compatibility and financial security, I replied. Section 15, Inheritance Clause. Upon the death of David Montgomery Parker, his wife Victoria Reynolds Parker inherits the entirety of his estate, including all Montgomery family trusts, properties, and investment accounts, with full discretionary authority over distribution to surviving family members. The silence that followed was absolute. Helen's face went through several expressions as the implications of what she just heard became clear. What does that mean? Whispered Margaret Ashford. I smiled at Helen, whose triumphant expression had completely disappeared. It means that if something happens to David, I inherit everything. The family fortune, the trust funds, the real estate portfolio, all of it. and I have complete authority to decide what, if anything, David's family members receive. Helen grabbed the document from my hands, scanning the legal language frantically. This can't be legal. It's completely legal. Drafted by Montgomery family attorneys and executed according to Massachusetts state law. David signed it willingly after extensive consultation with his legal counsel. David was reading over his mother's shoulder, his own eyes widening as he remembered the document he'd signed 5 years ago. Victoria, I never realized the inheritance clause was so comprehensive, I finished. Your attorney explained that it was the standard protection for marriages involving significant family wealth. Helen was still staring at the document, her face pale with shock. But this means that if your son dies before me, his family fortune becomes my family fortune, I said clearly. Every investment, every trust fund, every piece of property that's been in the Montgomery family for generations would legally belong to the woman you just declared isn't good enough for your son. The guests were looking back and forth between Helen and me like spectators at a tennis match. The power dynamic that had defined our relationship for 5 years had just been completely reversed. Furthermore, I continued, pulling out another section of the prenup. Section 23 establishes that any family member who contests the inheritance provisions or attempts to interfere with the marriage forfeits any discretionary bequests I might choose to make. Helen's hands were shaking as she held the document. David, tell me you understand what this means. David nodded slowly. It means Victoria protected both of us. If we divorce, she gets nothing from the family money. But if I die first, she inherits everything and decides what happens to it, including, I added conversationally, whether surviving family members receive anything at all. Helen sank into the nearest chair, the weight of her miscalculation becoming clear. For 5 years, she treated me like an unwelcome intruder who could be intimidated into leaving. She'd never imagined that I might be the person who would ultimately control the family fortune she was so desperate to protect. Helen, I said gently, you've spent 5 years telling me I'm not good enough for David, not worthy of the Montgomery name, not capable of understanding your family's standards. You've made it clear that you view me as a temporary inconvenience who will eventually be replaced by someone more suitable. I paused, letting her absorb the full implications of the legal document she was holding. Unfortunately for you, David and I are very happily married. We have no intention of divorcing, which means that someday, probably many years from now, I will become the sole controller of every asset you've spent your life trying to preserve for Montgomery family members. The garden was completely silent except for the sound of Helen's rapid breathing. So, I continued, I suggest you reconsider your approach to our relationship. Because the woman you just declared isn't good enough for your son is the woman who will ultimately decide whether you spend your retirement in comfort or poverty. Charles Ashford cleared his throat uncomfortably. Perhaps we should give the family some privacy to discuss this. Actually, I said, I think we're finished discussing it. Helen now understands the legal realities of our marriage. There's nothing left to explain. David moved to stand beside me, his arm around my waist in a gesture of support. Mother, I think you owe Victoria an apology. Helen looked up from the prenuptial agreement, her face a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and dawning respect. Victoria, I had no idea. You had no idea that the woman you've been condescending to for 5 years is actually the person who will inherit your family's entire fortune, I asked. Or you had no idea that treating your son's wife with disrespect might have consequences. Both, Helen whispered. I walked over to where she sat and gently took the prenuptial agreement from her hands. Helen, I've never wanted your family's money. I make an excellent living in my own career. But David insisted on the inheritance clause because he wanted to ensure that his wife would be financially secure regardless of what happened to him. She nodded, still processing the reversal of everything she believed about our marriage. What I do want, I continued, is basic respect. Not because I'll inherit your family fortune, but because I'm a successful professional who loves your son and has been a faithful member of this family for 5 years. You're right, Helen said quietly. I've been unfair to you. You've been cruel, I corrected. You've spent 5 years trying to make me feel unwelcome in my own marriage. You've criticized my background, questioned my worthiness, and suggested that David should have married someone else. Helen's eyes filled with tears. I thought I was protecting him. From what? From a Harvard Law graduate who helps major corporations navigate complex legal challenges. From someone who insisted on a prenuptial agreement to protect his family's interests. From a wife who supports his career and makes him genuinely happy. David squeezed my hand. Victoria, she understands now. Does she? I asked, looking directly at Helen. Because I need to know that this behavior stops immediately. No more subtle insults. No more suggestions that I'm not worthy of the Montgomery name. No more treating me like a temporary inconvenience. Helen wiped her eyes and stood up slowly. Victoria, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you respect, and I owe David an apology for trying to undermine his marriage. She turned to address the guests who were still standing in awkward silence. I was wrong about Victoria. Completely wrong. She's been a wonderful wife to David and a more generous family member than I deserved. Margaret Ashford approached with a small smile. Victoria, I have to admit, that was the most impressive legal maneuvering I've ever witnessed at a social gathering. Charles nodded approvingly. Beautifully handled. You turned what could have been a devastating public humiliation into a demonstration of strength and preparation. Other guests began approaching to offer their congratulations on our anniversary and their admiration for how I'd handled Helen's attack. The evening that had started as Helen's public declaration of my unworthiness had become a celebration of my tactical brilliance. David pulled me aside while guests resumed their conversations. Victoria, I had no idea Mother had been so terrible to you. Why didn't you tell me? Because I was handling it, I replied. And because you love your mother despite her flaws. I didn't want to force you to choose between us. You'll never have to worry about that again, he said firmly. What she said tonight was unforgivable. It was illuminating, I corrected. Now she understands exactly what she has to lose if she continues treating me poorly. As the evening wound down and guests departed, Helen approached me one final time. Victoria, may I speak with you privately? We walked to a quiet corner of the garden where the catering staff was beginning to clean up the remnants of what would undoubtedly become legendary gossip in the Montgomery family social circle. I need you to understand something, Helen said. I wasn't trying to be cruel. I was trying to protect David from what I thought was a mistake. Based on what evidence? My educational background? My professional success? My treatment of your son? Based on fear, she admitted. Fear that David was throwing away advantages I'd spent my life preserving for him. I studied her carefully. For the first time since I'd known her, Helen looked genuinely vulnerable rather than calculating. Helen, the advantages you're trying to preserve aren't worth anything if they require David to marry someone he doesn't love. I understand that now. Do you? Because this isn't just about inheritance documents or legal technicalities. This is about whether you can accept that David chose me for reasons that have nothing to do with social status or family connections. Helen was quiet for a long moment. He chose well, she said finally. Better than I gave him credit for. He chose for love, I replied. The same way he chooses to maintain a relationship with a mother who spent 5 years trying to sabotage his marriage. She flinched at the accuracy of my assessment. What can I do to make this right? Start by treating me like David's wife, instead of like someone who's temporarily borrowing your son. And the prenuptial agreement? I smiled. The prenuptial agreement protects everyone's interests, including yours. As long as you treat me with respect, you have nothing to worry about. 6 months later, Helen and I had developed what could almost be called a friendship. She still hosted elaborate social events and maintained her position in the city's high society circles, but she no longer treated me like an unwelcome outsider. Instead, she began introducing me as her brilliant daughter-in-law who'd graduated from Harvard Law and specialized in corporate mergers. She talked about my professional accomplishments with the same pride she'd previously reserved for David's career achievements. The change wasn't just social politeness. Helen had genuinely begun to appreciate that her son's happiness mattered more than social conventions. She'd also realized that having a successful attorney as a daughter-in-law provided certain advantages in her social circle. David and I celebrated our 6th anniversary with a small dinner party that Helen organized according to my preferences rather than her own. The guest list included people David and I actually enjoyed spending time with, rather than just impressive names from the social register. During the toasts, Helen stood up to address the guests. 5 years ago, I thought David was making a mistake by marrying outside our immediate social circle. I was wrong about everything except David's judgment. Victoria has been the best thing that ever happened to our family. She raised her glass toward me. To the woman who was smart enough to protect everyone's interests, strong enough to stand up to family interference, and patient enough to give a stubborn mother-in-law time to recognize her value. As guests applauded, I reflected on a long journey from Helen's hostility to her genuine acceptance. The prenuptial agreement that she discovered at our anniversary party had been my insurance policy, but respect had been earned through years of professional success and personal integrity. Sometimes the most satisfying victory isn't destroying your enemies. Sometimes it's forcing them to acknowledge that they were wrong about who you are and what you're worth. Helen had spent 5 years trying to make me feel inferior. In the end, she learned that the woman she dismissed was actually the person who held her family's future in her hands. The legal documents were just paperwork. The real power had always been in refusing to accept Helen's assessment of my worth, maintaining my professional excellence, and proving through actions rather than arguments that David had chosen wisely. 7 years later, when Helen's friends ask about her daughter-in-law, she tells them I'm the most accomplished attorney in the city and the perfect wife for her son. She's learned that family strength comes from supporting each other's success rather than competing for social status. And the prenuptial agreement? It remains filed safely in our home office, protecting everyone's interests while serving as a reminder that the most effective defense against prejudice is preparation, patience, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're worth.